Hash the diary in the attic. A cold case reopened after 40 years on a gray Tuesday morning in October 1983 in the quiet town of Heatherbrook. Something happened that would remain hidden for 4 decades. 37-year-old schoolteacher Margaret Holloway disappeared from her home on Linden Lane. Her car was found parked at the railway station, engines still warm, her handbag resting on the passenger seat. But Margaret Holloway herself was nowhere to be seen. The investigation that followed was thorough by the standards of the time. Officers interviewed neighbors, searched the surrounding woodland, and questioned her colleagues at the primary school where she taught Year 4. They found nobody. They found no witnesses. And after 18 months, the case was quietly moved to the cold case files, where it gathered dust alongside hundreds of other unsolved disappearances. For 40 years, Margaret's disappearance remained one of those mysteries that occasionally surfaced in local conversation, speculated over in the pub, wondered about at school reunions. What happened to the pretty teacher with the red hair and the kind smile? Why did she vanish without a trace on an ordinary autumn day? Then, in the spring of 2024, a property developer purchased the empty house on Linden Lane. The dilapidated structure was scheduled for demolition to make way for modern housing. During the clearance work, a construction worker discovered a wooden box in the ceiling space above the master bedroom. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound diary and a collection of letters tied with faded ribbon. The police were called immediately. Forensics dated the items to the early 1980s, and when investigators opened the diary, they found the handwriting of Margaret Holloway, and a story that had been waiting nearly 40 years to be told. Margaret Ellen Holloway had come to Heatherbrook in 1979, relocating from a larger town where she had taught for 8 years. Colleagues remembered her as dedicated, private, and somewhat isolated. She lived alone in the 3-bedroom house she had inherited from a distant relative, a house that had sat empty for years before her arrival. She kept herself to herself, they said, never spoke much about her past, but in her diary a different picture emerged. The entries began in September 1981, 2 years before her disappearance, and revealed a woman in the grip of fear. Margaret wrote of feeling watched, of noticing a man who seemed to appear wherever she went, of receiving phone calls where no one spoke. She described the terror of sleeping with the lights on, of checking the locks repeatedly, of jumping at every sound. I want you to understand something about Margaret Holloway. She was not a woman given to fantasy or exaggeration. Her colleagues described her as grounded, practical, the sort of person who believed in logic and reason. Yet here, in her private diary, she wrote of being followed to the shops, of seeing a figure standing at the end of her garden in the small hours of the morning, of finding her greenhouse smashed and nothing taken. On the 17th of October 1983, just 3 days before she vanished, Margaret made her final diary entry. Her handwriting was shaky, the pen pressed so hard into the paper that it left grooves visible even now. She wrote, "He is found where I live. I know his face now. I should have run when I had the chance. If anyone finds this, please find the truth. Find what he did with her." Her. The word hung in the air when detectives first read it. Her. Not me. Margaret Holloway had been afraid of someone, but in her final entry, she wrote of another woman, a woman who had already been taken, a woman whose fate remained unknown. The letters found alongside the diary proved even more troubling. They were correspondence between Margaret and a woman named Catherine Wells, who had lived in Heatherbrook in the late 1970s. Catherine had been a nurse at the local hospital, young, ambitious, well-liked. In 1978, she too had disappeared without explanation. Her case had never been solved, but here, in Margaret's possession, were 7 letters written by Catherine Wells in the months before her disappearance. They spoke of a relationship, a secret relationship, with a man she had met at a church function. A man she described as charming, attentive, everything she had ever wanted. Then, in her final letter, dated June 1978, a sudden change of tone. Catherine wrote of feeling trapped, of things she couldn't tell anyone, of a man who wouldn't let her leave. 3 months later, Catherine Wells vanished. For decades, these two cases had been treated as separate tragedies. Now, detectives were staring at evidence that suggested a single predator, someone who had targeted two women in the same small town, 8 years apart, and had eluded justice entirely. The investigation that followed was unlike anything Heatherbrook had ever experienced. Detectives re-examined the original missing person files. They traced Catherine Wells's movements in the spring of 1978, tracking down old colleagues, revisiting the hospital where she had worked. They built a timeline of Margaret Holloway's final weeks, cross-referencing her diary entries with phone records, bank statements, and witness statements from the time. They found something extraordinary. A man had lived in Heatherbrook between 1977 and 1979. His name was David Allen Renard. He had moved to the town claiming to be a civil engineer working on a local infrastructure project. He was described as personable, well-spoken, exactly the sort of man who would be welcomed into a small community. He had attended the same church where Catherine Wells volunteered. He had taken a particular interest in her. Renard had left Heatherbrook abruptly in early 1979, telling neighbors that his contract had ended and he needed to relocate for work. But here was the detail that made investigators' skin crawl. He had not simply vanished. In the weeks before his departure, he had been seen on multiple occasions at the house on Linden Lane, the very house where Margaret Holloway would eventually live. The timeline WS Chinese letter. The house had belonged to Margaret's relative before her. Was it possible that David Renard had been watching the property, waiting for the right occupant? Had he followed Margaret from her previous town, as her diary suggested? The investigators found no direct evidence of this, no paper trail linking Margaret's move to Renard's presence. But the coincidence troubled them deeply. So what happened to David Allen Renard? This is where the story takes its most puzzling turn. Detectives traced him through employment records, tax filings, and national insurance contributions. They found that after leaving Heatherbrook, he had worked on construction projects across southern England under a series of different names. He had married in 1985, a woman from Cornwall who described him as quiet and devoted. They had 2 children. He had been a regular, unremarkable figure in his community for decades. And then, in 2012, David Renard had died. A heart attack at the age of 63 while walking his dog on a country path in Dorset. His widow had him cremated, and his ashes were scattered in a local garden of remembrance. He had died a free man. In 2024, detectives interviewed his widow. She knew nothing of Heatherbrook, nothing of Catherine Wells, nothing of Margaret Holloway. She described a gentle, loving husband who had never raised his voice to her or their children. She was, she said, completely unprepared for what she learned about his past. The letters between Margaret and Catherine were forensically tested. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, all dated to the periods described. There was no reason to doubt their authenticity. But one question remained unanswered. How had Margaret come to possess these letters? Had Catherine given them to her before she vanished? Had Margaret somehow discovered them? Or had someone else placed them in her possession? And there was another mystery that investigators could not resolve. Catherine Wells had vanished in 1978. Margaret Holloway had lived in Heatherbrook for 4 years before her own disappearance in 1983. Why had it taken so long for the fear to escalate? What had triggered those final diary entries in 1981? What had Margaret discovered, or what had been discovered about her, that brought the past rushing back? Perhaps we will never know the full truth. Perhaps the answers died with David Renard or with Margaret Holloway, whose body has never been found. In March of this year, detectives formally reopened the investigation into Catherine Wells's death. They are treating it as a murder inquiry, the first time such a designation has been applied to her case. They have exhumed no body because no body was ever located. But they have promised to follow every lead, to examine every piece of evidence, to give Catherine Wells the investigation she deserved 46 years ago. The diary and letters have been returned to Catherine Wells's family. Her younger sister, now 67 and living in Wales, asked that we use her name. She told us she had waited decades to hear that someone was finally looking for her sister properly. She said she still dreams of Catherine, of the day she didn't come home, of the phone call that changed everything. We asked her what she wanted the public to know. She thought for a long moment before answering. She was 23 years old, she said. She had her whole life ahead of her. Someone took that from her, and then they took her voice, and then they took her name. I just want people to remember that she existed, that she mattered. As for Margaret Holloway, the house on Linden Lane has been demolished. The site now lies empty, surrounded by hoardings advertising luxury apartments. The construction worker who found the box has left the industry. He told us he thinks about it every day. What if he had gone up into the attic a week earlier? What if he had never looked inside that ceiling space? He keeps the oilcloth in his garage, wrapped in a plastic bag. He doesn't know why he kept it. He just couldn't let it go. Some truths wait decades to be found. Some wait forever. The diary in the attic told a story of two women, a monster in plain sight, and a system that never connected the dots. But now that the story has been told, now that the names Catherine Wells and Margaret Holloway have been spoken aloud, the question remains. Somewhere in Dorset, in a quiet garden of remembrance, the ashes of David Allen Reynard rest beneath a modest stone. His widow visits on anniversaries, leaves flowers, remembers the man she married. But in Heatherbrook, in the cold case files, in the memories of those who knew them, Catherine and Margaret have not been forgotten. The investigation continues. And somewhere, perhaps, there is still someone who knows something that could finally bring peace to two families who have waited nearly half a century for answers.